Okay, so this thing's a Scandi grind, and bearing in mind I haven't been able to test this thing yet, I'm just going to use my experience and knowledge to sort of extrapolate or even guesstimate the sort of work this should be capable of doing. Now, a Scandi grind's okay, but to be honest with you, I believe a Scandi grind's better for smaller blades, like a 4 or 5 inch blade, maybe a smaller working knife. It's good for carving and so forth. It gives good control for carving, and a smaller working knife is a concept I discussed in a previous video in this playlist. I do question the Scandi grind's ability to do heavy work, and what's heavy work I deem as being full-on chopping work, chopping some small trees, branches, making poles and so forth, perhaps to build an emergency shelter or something. But maybe I'm being a bit harsh on that point. So I believe the Scandi grind is going to hold this thing back from being a more heavyweight tool doing that heavy work. Now, since this thing does have the characteristics of a good chopping tool, it will possibly or probably do that heavy work, chopping work, on a short-term basis. For example, you want to build an emergency shelter, a one-off shelter, depends what sort of shelter you want to build, of course, but cut a few poles, branches and so forth, the odd tree for short-term work, build an emergency shelter. It might also be good for your 2 or 3 day camping trip, for example. I don't think this is really going to be suited to doing that heavy chopping work on a medium to long-term basis. That's really for a small axe or a heavy-duty machete like the M1 machete I talk about in a previous video in this playlist. That's really the only machete I can vouch for. When I talk about machetes, I don't talk about any machete. It's got to be a heavy machete that can chop all day, every day, and I can vouch for that M1 machete. So this thing, having said that, will probably or definitely do all your medium work. In other words, what I deem to be betoning, or your betoning, creating fuel for a fire, perhaps more chopping, a bit of hacking tinder and so forth, but basically betoning fuel for a fire is going to do all that medium work. That's the sort of work you expect your main working knife to do on a long-term basis, and your main working knife is your 6-inch full-tang blade. 6 inches plenty, as long as it's teamed up with a small axe or a machete, and I talk about that concept of a main working knife in a previous video in this playlist. So with a Scandi grind, despite this thing being a huge 9-inch blade and having the characteristics for chopping, it's not really in that heavier class range. It's more in your main working knife class range. It's not in the class range of a small axe or a machete. Perhaps you can deem this to be a main working knife or a main bushcraft knife on steroids, for example. Now, if this thing had a more durable grind, for example, like a convex grind or a standard bevel, then you can possibly do that heavy work on a medium-term basis. I'm still not going to say long-term basis. That's really for your heavier tool like a small axe or a machete, but at least on a more short to definitely short, maybe medium-term. And what's a standard bevel? A standard bevel is where the bevel starts a lot closer to the edge and comes straight down in a single bevel, giving you a less acute angle to the tip, like a shallow pyramid, 40-degree pyramid and so forth, and that's going to be a lot more durable. It's going to have more metal behind the bevel, and that's a durable blade, or else a convex grind, which is durable as well. Now, if you start convex shaping your Scandi grind, that's fine by me. Some people do that. If you sharpen a Scandi grind incorrectly, you can start putting a convex shape there without even knowing it, and that's actually fine as well because it just makes it more durable. So now we get to the last point that I want to make. It's the most important point because this is actually my advice. Up until now it's all been my opinions. Now, if you're taking a heavy duty tool like a small axe or a heavy machete, then your main working knife, your next level tool down, can be the 6-inch blade. That's plenty. Like I talk about in previous videos, a 6-inch full-tang blade is plenty. But if you're not taking your small axe or machete, then I advise you possibly to beef up your main working knife. In other words, the largest tool you're going to have into something like this, a more kick-ass tool, 9-inch blade that can chop. So then at least you can do some heavy work, at least on a short-term basis, just in case if you need to build an emergency shelter, for example. You can cut a few trees and branches and so forth. But again, if you're going to be taking a small axe and or a machete, then you can come back, your main working knife can come back to a 6-inch blade, that's fine. Then you don't even need to take a tool like that. That's really for, if you're not taking that heavy tool, that's an option. This is like an in-between tool. If you're not taking that larger tool, just in case you need to do some heavy work, this is like an in-between tool that beefs up your main working knife if you don't have that heavier small axle machete. Because don't forget, you're not going to be chopping with your main working knife, your main bushcraft knife. It's even a 6-inch blade, or especially a smaller blade, you're not chopping with that. Either a straight blade or a bit of a bulge. The bit of a bulge, like I show you in previous videos, that knife option I can give you with a bulge, does give you a bit more chopping ability, but not much. You're not going to do much chopping at all with your 6-inch blade or a smaller blade. So that's my advice. You can beef up to that if you're not taking that heavier tool. If you are taking the heavier tool, like a small axle machete, you don't even need to take that. So that's really my advice. Any questions or comments, let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.